Back at it again, the last one. Now, does the fragmentation of the production process present an opportunity or threat for distant African economies, right? Now, in order for me to answer this question, I'll go back to the Grossman and Rosie Hansenberg 2006 model. And now what I'll take from there is the parameter beta, which represents the feasibility in offshoring. Thus, the reduction in the parameter represents an improvement in the technology of logistics and communications and so forth, right? So now this represents an opportunity for distant African economies, because those countries that could not trade before the introduction of trade can now trade. Now this increases the volume of trade, and which has good benefits to the productive capacities of these distant African economies, right? And thus that's one of the consequences of the fragmentation of the production process, or the proliferation of the technology in the logistics and communication. Now, what we can therefore then consider in terms of this fragmentation process is that there will be the productivity effect, then there's the relative or the labor supply effect. We can therefore then see that the we do not necessarily need to consider the relative price effect, because African countries are usually smaller in regards to the world price and output. Now, with that being said, now we can therefore then see that if we have good policies in place whereby the laborers are better employable as most, and the labor markets are not as rigid as other labor markets in other countries, that can mean that the productivity effect as a consequence of this fragmentation will therefore mean that there will be a greater, the productivity effect will be greater, a greater productivity effect, and the labor supply effect will be smaller. Now this therefore then implies that there will be a wage increase in the tasks that are being offshored. Now that is in relation to the first equation that we looked at, and that is equation star. Now, an example of this is Japan in the late 20th century, where Japan was offshoring to its economies, or the Asian tigers that are in close proximity to it, right? So what therefore then tended to happen in Japan was that there was the low-skilled tasks that were given to Taiwan, Korea, and China. Now the laborers in Japan migrated to relatively higher skills. Now therefore there was relatively no impact in the labor supply effect, but there was an increase actually in the productivity effect, and thus an increase in the wage rate in Japan. So that is an example of the potential opportunity that this can have in regards to distant African economies. Now, a lot of the thing that is not considered by the literature that we've read, but we know of, is that the geography in Africa will also be an issue in terms of trade, but the reduction in the beta represents a good opportunity for that trade to take place, right? So, now another thing to which can be represented as an opportunity is the wage and productivity gap, right? So for instance, if African laborers move so to the technological frontier, what can therefore then become as a consequence of offshoring, or the fragmentation of the production process, is that even if our foreign counterparts, in terms of the tasks that they do, are more productive than we are, but because of the wage discrepancy, firms will have an incentive to to utilize the labor here in Africa, because the wage and productivity gap will be too large, and therefore thus incentivize firms to come to Africa. Now, that is basically the two opportunities that we realize in regards to what can happen if the fragmentation of the production process increases. Now, threat of the technology. Now, because Africa, its industries are relatively in their infancy. So now what can therefore tend to happen as a consequence of this fragmentation process is that the development of these infant industries will not happen as a consequence, right? Now, what we therefore also need to consider is that we are in the age whereby there's the development of artificial intelligence, which may therefore also imply that the old model, or the old paradigm in which whereby there is now the proliferation of the manufacturing industries will therefore then be obliterated. And we've then thus moved into a new world where now the manufacturing process is taken up by more capital than there is labor. So the threat of technology is one too which can be muted by artificial intelligence, and therefore the fragmentation of the production process represents more of an opportunity than it does a threat. That was the presentation from me and Ashley Kalinde in the Grade Unbundling, and thank you guys for listening.